There's a moment in history that doesn't get much attention. Not a battle, not a revolution, just thinking. Quiet, methodical thinking about resources, timing, and consequences. And what emerged from that thinking wasn't a weapon or an empire, it was a framework. A way of understanding stability, scarcity, and control so advanced that it would take the rest of the world nearly 2,000 years to develop anything comparable. Most people assume that strategic thinking, real, deliberate planning about resources and long-term outcomes, is a modern invention, something born in military academies, corporate boardrooms, or Renaissance statecraft. But history complicates that assumption. Long before the modern era, during a time of fragmentation and constant conflict in ancient China, a group of thinkers began documenting something remarkable. They weren't philosophers debating abstract ideals. They were advisors confronting urgent realities: how to prevent famine, how to stabilize prices, how to stop powerful merchants from manipulating markets, how to build a state strong enough to survive when rival kingdoms were locked in permanent competition. Their method wasn't dramatic, it was observational. They studied cycles, seasons, human behavior, and scarcity. And from those patterns, they developed principles of balance, timing, and control that transformed governance into something systematic. So the real question becomes, what did these early thinkers understand about human decision-making and resource management that allowed their ideas to shape power structures for centuries? To understand what these thinkers accomplished, we need to step into their world. Ancient China during the Warring States period, roughly 475 to 221 BCE, was not a unified empire. It was a fractured landscape of 7 major rival states, each competing for survival and dominance. This wasn't the orderly hierarchy of earlier dynasties. The old ritual order had collapsed. What replaced it was something historians describe as big fish eating small fish, centuries of smaller city-states being absorbed into larger territorial powers. Hundreds of agrarian communities merged into bureaucratic states with professional armies and complex administrative systems. But here's what matters for our story. This wasn't just political transformation. The entire economic foundation was shifting. The Iron Revolution had arrived. New tools meant farmers could cultivate land more effectively. Family farms became the basic unit of agricultural production, replacing older collective systems. Productivity increased dramatically. With surplus food came specialization, artisans, merchants, a functional division of labor across regions. And with that came markets. Not the state-controlled distribution systems of the Western Zhou, where prices were fixed by decree and commerce was tightly regulated. Real markets. Places where supply and demand created price fluctuations, where private merchants emerged as a new social class, moving goods across regions, accumulating wealth independently of aristocratic lineage. This created a problem: instability. Grain prices swung violently between seasons. During autumn harvests, prices collapsed. By spring planting season, when farmers had consumed their stores, prices skyrocketed. Merchants who understood these cycles could buy cheap and sell dear, accumulating enormous wealth while farmers struggled. The gap between rich and poor widened. Famines became more devastating when local shortages couldn't be balanced by redistribution. For rulers of these competing states, this volatility was existential. A state that couldn't feed its people couldn't field armies. A state where wealth concentrated in merchant hands rather than state coffers couldn't build infrastructure or defend borders. So the question facing state advisors was urgent. How do you harness market forces without destroying them? How do you create stability in a system driven by self-interest and competition? The prevailing attitudes reflected this tension. Resources, particularly grain, were understood as the foundation of everything: military strength, social order, state revenue, survival itself. But the old methods of direct control through taxation and price fixing were breaking down. Something more sophisticated was needed. This context shaped a particular kind of thinking: long-term over short-term, sustainability over exploitation. Understanding patterns rather than imposing rigid rules. The goal wasn't to create an ideal society. It was to work with human nature, including greed, self-interest, and the pursuit of profit, and channel those forces toward stability and prosperity. What emerged from this crucible was something remarkable. The most comprehensive expression of this strategic thinking appears in a collection of texts known as the Guanzi. Named after Guanzhong, a renowned statesman who served in the state of Qi during the 7th century BCE, these writings weren't actually authored by him. They were composed later, probably during the mid-warring states period, by anonymous state planners and economic advisors. Think about that for a moment. These weren't individual philosophers building grand theories. They were practitioners, people embedded in government administration, watching economic forces play out in real time, trying to solve actual problems. Their insights came from observation, experimentation, and the accumulated experience of managing a state during turbulent times. At the heart of the Guanzi lies a concept called qingzhang, literally light-heavy. Heavy meant important, essential, expensive. Light meant unimportant, inessential, cheap. But here's what made this framework sophisticated. Nothing was inherently heavy or light. These were relational terms, context-dependent. A commodity's importance shifted with seasons, with supply conditions, with market dynamics. The writers observed several patterns. First, scarcity drove prices. When things were plentiful, they became cheap. When scarce, expensive. This seems obvious, but they pushed further. Scarcity wasn't just about absolute quantities. It was also about distribution. Goods concentrated in a few hands, monopolized, became expensive even if total supply was adequate. Artificial scarcity created by market structure mattered as much as natural scarcity. Second, demand patterns influenced value. Goods people hoarded as stores of wealth increased in price when uncertainty made people hoard more. Today we'd call this a rush to safety assets. They saw it as a predictable human response to instability. Third, time pressure created shocks. If the government suddenly demanded taxes paid in a specific commodity and demanded it quickly, the price of that commodity would spike. Not because supply decreased or inherent value changed, but because timing concentrated demand. These weren't abstract theories. They observed regularities in how markets actually behaved. But observation alone wasn't enough. The crucial insight was this: if you understood these patterns, you could work with them. You could anticipate fluctuations. You could position the state to stabilize prices not by decree, but by participation. Here's how it worked in practice. The central problem was grain price volatility. Grain wasn't just another commodity. It was the people's master of destiny, the foundation of survival and social stability. When grain prices collapsed in autumn after harvests, farmers couldn't afford to hold their surplus and were forced to sell at losses. When prices spiked in spring before planting, those same farmers might have to buy food at inflated prices, falling into debt to merchants. Guanzi proposed something elegant. The state should establish public granaries in each locality. During autumn harvest, when grain was cheap and money was heavy, valuable, the state should buy substantial amounts at fair prices. This prevented price collapse. It protected farmers from being forced to sell their entire harvest immediately, and it withdrew grain from the market, storing it for later. Then, during spring and summer, when grain was scarce and expensive, the state should sell from these reserves at reasonable prices. This prevented price spikes. It protected farmers who needed to buy food while their crops grew, and it balanced supply and demand across seasons. Notice what's happening here. The state wasn't fixing prices by decree. It wasn't commanding how much grain could cost. It was participating in the market, buying when cheap, selling when expensive, using market mechanisms to achieve stability. This approach served multiple purposes simultaneously. It generated government revenue. Because the state bought low and sold high, even while moderating the extremes, it could fund operations without imposing heavy direct taxes. The Guanzi explicitly notes, by taking advantage of government orders to move goods and money back and forth, there is no need to make any demands on the people in the form of special taxes and levies. It prevented extreme inequality. If the government didn't participate in seasonal price swings, private merchants would. Merchants who understood these cycles could accumulate enormous wealth buying from desperate farmers in autumn and selling to desperate farmers in spring. By moderating price fluctuations, the state limited these opportunities for exploitation. As the Guanzi warned, if the prince is not able to control the situation, it will lead to large-scale traders roaming the markets and taking advantage of the people's lack of things to increase their capital 100-fold. It created famine resilience. Grain stored in local granaries could be released during natural disasters or crop failures. This wasn't just humanitarian, it was strategic. A state that could buffer its population against famine maintained social stability and military capacity when rivals might collapse into chaos. And it stabilized the broader economy. Guanzi observed that grain price movements affected all other prices. When grain was expensive, everything else became relatively cheap because people spent so much on food they had less for other goods. When grain was cheap, Other goods became relatively expensive as people had money for discretionary purchases. By stabilizing grain prices, the state stabilized the entire price level. The human motivations behind this system are worth noting. The advisors who developed these ideas didn't assume people would behave virtuously. They explicitly stated, "It is the nature of men that whenever they see profit, they cannot help chasing after it." Self-interest, including greed and profit-seeking, was taken as given. But rather than trying to suppress these tendencies through moral education or legal punishment, the strategy was to channel them. Create conditions where individual profit-seeking serves collective stability. Merchants could still trade. Farmers could still respond to price signals. But the state's participation prevented the most extreme outcomes. The unintended consequence, or perhaps the most profound consequence, was institutional. This wasn't just a policy. It was a template for how the government could relate to markets, not as outside controllers imposing rules, but as sophisticated participant understanding and influencing flows. These principles shaped governance structures that persisted across dynasties, influencing how Chinese states approached economic management for centuries. The quiet genius wasn't in any single mechanism. It was in the mode of thinking, empirical observation over moral prescription, working with forces rather than against them, long-term sustainability over short-term extraction. Understanding that stability required constant balancing, not static rules. What makes this early strategic thinking remarkable isn't that it was unique to one place or time. It's that it reveals a tendency that surfaces repeatedly when humans face similar challenges, the instinct to weigh immediate needs against future security. This pattern appears across human history in different forms. Consider ancient Egyptian resource management during the Pharaonic period. Egypt's prosperity depended on the Nile's flooding cycle, predictable yet variable. Too little flooding meant famine. Officials developed granary systems not unlike those in the Guanzi, storing surplus from abundant years to buffer against lean years. The motivation was similar: prevent the social collapse that comes from resource volatility. The implementation required the same kind of thinking: anticipate patterns, act during periods of abundance to prepare for scarcity. Or look at Roman approaches to grain supply in the late Republic and early Empire. As Rome grew into a massive urban center, feeding the population became a political imperative. The Annona system, state management of grain procurement and distribution, emerged not from abstract planning but from hard experience. Leaders learned that grain shortages led to riots, riots led to instability, and instability threatened power. So they developed sophisticated logistics, contracts with grain-producing provinces, shipping networks, public granaries, price subsidies during shortages. Again, the core insight: immediate crises are less expensive than preventable catastrophes. The pattern isn't about identical solutions. It's about a shared recognition. Systems driven purely by immediate self-interest tend toward extremes. Those extremes create vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities eventually threaten everyone, including those who profited from them. What distinguished the thinking documented in texts like the Guanzi was its systematic quality. These weren't just emergency measures enacted during crises. They were frameworks attempting to understand why crises occurred and how to prevent them structurally. The advisors observed that markets without participation from institutions focused on long-term stability would oscillate between gluts and shortages. They noticed that when critical resources became too concentrated in private hands, the majority became vulnerable to exploitation. They recognized that taxation policies that ignored timing and market dynamics could trigger the very crises they aimed to prevent. These observations reflect something fundamental about human decision-making under uncertainty. When individuals face variable conditions, seasonal fluctuations, unpredictable harvests, shifting prices, rational short-term behavior can create collectively irrational long-term outcomes. Everyone selling grain immediately after harvest because they need money creates a price collapse that hurts everyone. Everyone hoarding grain before spring because they anticipate shortages creates the shortage they fear. Strategic thinking emerges when someone steps back from immediate pressures and asks, what pattern is this creating? Where does this trajectory lead? What intervention might shift the pattern towards stability rather than crisis? This isn't about suppressing self-interest. It's about recognizing that unmediated self-interest in complex systems produces volatility, and volatility itself becomes costly. The farmer forced to sell harvest grain at loss and buy planting grain at premium isn't failing individually, they're caught in a predictable pattern. The merchant profiting from that pattern isn't evil, they're responding to incentives. But the system as a whole becomes fragile. The tendency to develop foresight in response to these patterns isn't universal or automatic. It requires certain conditions, enough stability to think beyond immediate survival, enough complexity that patterns become visible, enough institutional capacity to act on insights, and often enough competition that failure to think strategically means being outcompeted by those who do. The Warring States period had all these conditions. The competing kingdoms created evolutionary pressure. States that couldn't manage resources effectively lost wars and disappeared. The growing sophistication of markets made patterns more visible. The emergence of a class of professional administrators created carriers for this knowledge. What they developed wasn't strategy in the modern sense. It was something quieter, applied foresight about resource flows and human responses to scarcity and abundance. The interesting question isn't whether other cultures developed similar thinking. It's how different contexts produced different emphases while addressing similar underlying problems. In ancient Greece and Rome, discussions of price and resource allocation often emerged through moral philosophy. Plato and Aristotle approached questions of economic exchange by asking, what is just? What price should be charged? Their concern was individual virtue, the character of the seller, and the fairness of the transaction. This lineage continued through Roman law into scholastic debates about the just price. The focus was prescription, how people ought to behave. The Guanzi tradition operated differently. It took self-interest and profit-seeking as givens to work with rather than problems to solve through moral education. The focus was description and mechanism. How do prices actually move? What forces drive those movements? How can those forces be channeled? You can see faint parallels in later strategic traditions. Sun Tzu's Art of War, roughly contemporary with parts of the Guanzi, emphasized knowing circumstances, timing actions, avoiding prolonged resource drain. Different domain, warfare rather than economics, but similar mode of thinking. Observation of patterns, careful positioning, working with momentum rather than against it. Much later, European mercantilist thought in the 16th and 17th centuries grappled with state capacity and resource accumulation. Again, a different context, nation-states competing in emerging global trade, but some resemblance in questions. How does the state build strength through economic management? How does resource control translate to power? These aren't claims of direct influence. The point is more subtle. When humans with administrative responsibility face resource volatility in competitive environments, certain kinds of thinking become useful. Anticipation becomes valuable. Understanding system dynamics rather than just individual transactions becomes necessary. Balancing short-term pressures against long-term stability becomes strategic. The specific solutions differ. The Guanzi's grain price stabilization mechanism reflected China's agricultural base and emerging markets. Roman Annona systems reflected Mediterranean geography and imperial logistics. But the underlying challenge, managing resource flows to prevent destructive volatility, created parallel, if not identical, responses. What's striking about the Guanzi specifically isn't uniqueness. It's the sophistication and systematic quality of the thinking, documented and refined during a period the rest of the world wouldn't match for centuries. There's something quietly powerful in recognizing that strategic thinking about resources wasn't invented recently. That long before modern economics or management science, people were observing patterns, understanding incentives, thinking about how decisions ripple through systems over time. The thinkers behind texts like the Guanzi weren't trying to create timeless wisdom. They were solving immediate problems: how to feed populations, stabilize prices, prevent famines, generate revenue without crushing farmers, and build state capacity in an era of constant competition. But what they created transcended those immediate goals. They developed a mode of thinking, empirical, systematic, focused on working with forces rather than against them, that shaped how governments approached economic challenges for millennia. The lesson isn't that ancient China had all the answers. It's that the questions they asked and the careful observation they brought to those questions reveal something fundamental about human foresight. About the value of understanding systems rather than just reacting to crises. About the power of anticipation and positioning rather than rigid control. Perhaps the most elegant insight from this tradition is the simplest. Stability doesn't come from suppressing change. It comes from understanding patterns within chain and acting early enough to prevent extremes. Quiet strategy often outlasts visible power. If this kind of historical exploration into how humans think about complex problems interests you, you'll find more stories like this on the channel. Not lessons about what to do today, but deeper patterns in how people across time and place have approached similar challenges. Consider subscribing if that resonates.